In a world where trust is everything, what happens when that trust is shattered by the people you love most? A man, Mason Lucas, spent 10 years locked away, serving time for a crime he didn't commit. The betrayal came from the one person he thought he could trust, his own wife. And when he was finally released, he discovered the unimaginable. The very woman who had ruined his life, who had torn everything apart, was living out hers as if nothing had ever happened. But revenge comes with a price. Mason Lucas, a youth counselor from Charlotte, North Carolina, lived a simple life with his wife, Grace James. Their marriage seemed ordinary, though like any couple, they had their ups and downs. What Mason couldn't see, what he never suspected, was the slow erosion of their relationship, a quiet collapse masked by daily routines. He trusted Grace completely, never once imagining that the woman he loved would betray him in the worst possible way. Grace James, once his partner, his confidant, was becoming more distant. At first, it was the small things, less time spent at home, more nights spent out with friends. Then the secret started. Work became her excuse. A late night here, a business trip there. But Mason, ever patient, didn't think much of it until the day everything changed. Grace's growing detachment wasn't just an emotional distance. It was something much darker, more deliberate. And it wasn't long before Mason realized the truth. The whispers, the late-night phone calls. He was being replaced by someone else. Tony Lattimore. Tony Lattimore, confident, bold, everything Mason wasn't. A man with ambition, with charm that drew people in. He had been Grace's colleague at a law firm, someone Mason had always considered a friend, never suspecting that their bond was more than just professional. But that was the mask. Underneath, Tony was the catalyst for everything that would tear Mason's life apart. Tony's presence was subtle at first, but it wasn't long before it became clear. He and Grace shared more than just office gossip. They shared a dangerous chemistry. And it wasn't a matter of if, just when Mason would find out. Grace, with Tony by her side, plotted the perfect lie. They framed Mason for a crime he didn't commit. A drug charge. A setup so precise, so cruel, that Mason was left with no chance to defend himself. The result, 15 years in prison. Grace wasn't just having an affair. She wasn't just lost in a fleeting moment of weakness. No, this was something far colder, far more calculated. What began as doubt in her heart, doubt about Mason, about their marriage, morphed into something much darker. The seeds of betrayal took root, fed by jealousy, suspicion, and a desire for a life she felt Mason couldn't provide. She had created a narrative in her mind, and in that narrative, Mason was the villain. It wasn't even about Tony anymore. He was just a means to an end. Grace, in the midst of her emotional confusion, decided that Mason had wronged her first. She convinced herself that he was the one hiding secrets, that he was the one who didn't deserve her, that he was the one breaking the vows they had shared. It was the perfect justification for what came next, a scheme to destroy him. Grace knew Mason's routine. She knew where he kept his things, what he drove, and who he interacted with. And so, when she was alone, when Mason was working long hours, Grace made her move. She planted the drugs quietly, deliberately, making sure to leave just enough evidence to implicate him. It wasn't random. It wasn't a mistake. It was planned. The trap was set. All she needed now was the final piece. She called Tony, her accomplice. He was ready, and together, they watched from the shadows as Mason drove home, completely unaware of the life-altering surprise that awaited him. When the police arrived, Mason was stunned. His heart pounded. His mind raced. What was happening? He was handcuffed before he could even understand why. The drugs were planted, and no one believed him when he said he was innocent. Not even Grace, his wife, the woman he had trusted more than anyone in the world. In the courtroom, it was the same story. Grace took the stand, looking composed, but her words were poison. She spoke of Mason's secrets, of his betrayal. She claimed that he had been running drugs, that he had kept it hidden from her for months. Her testimony was smooth, rehearsed, and convincing. Mason's protest meant nothing. His words fell on deaf ears as Grace painted a twisted, fabricated image of her husband as a criminal. The jury believed her. How could they not? She was his wife. They thought she was trustworthy. And Mason? He was the man on trial. He was the one who stood accused, the one who was guilty in their eyes. But what they didn't know, what no one knew, was that Mason was being framed by the one person he loved the most. Life was shattered in that moment. The truth, his truth, was drowned out by Grace's lies. He had no defense, no chance. The sentence was swift. 15 years. 15 years for a crime he didn't commit, all because Grace believed the lie she had created. She had crafted a narrative in her mind, and now he was paying the price. The gavel fell, sealing his fate. Mason sat there in disbelief. How had it come to this? How had he lost everything to the woman he once trusted above all else? 15 years. It felt like a lifetime. And in that moment, as he was led away in chains, he made a vow to make Grace pay for what she had done. But vengeance would have to wait. The man who walked into prison was not the same man who walked out. Prison has a way of shaping people, of breaking them down only to build them back up, but in ways no one expects. When Mason first arrived at the prison, he was shattered. His world was gone. His wife, the life he had built, and his sense of justice, all of it was taken from him by the one person who swore to stand by him. The pain of betrayal weighed on him heavily in those early days. There were nights when he could barely sleep, haunted by images of Grace's face, her betrayal, and the lies she told to send him away. But Mason had a choice, sink or survive. And survival was all he knew. The months turned into years, and the fire inside him began to burn hotter. He started to change. At first, it was small little moments where he refused to let the guards break him. But soon, Mason found a purpose. He stopped focusing on the hurt and began to focus on the future, on what he would do when he got out. He read law books, studied criminal procedure, and worked out until his muscles ached. He learned how to survive in a system designed to destroy men like him. Prison was no longer just a place where he was serving time. It became the forge that would shape him into something else. The Mason Lucas that walked into that prison was a man driven by one singular thought: revenge. And over the years, that thought became an obsession, a need that consumed him. With each passing day, the man who had once been gentle, trusting, and naive grew harder. His pain turned into anger, and his anger turned into determination. Mason knew that if he ever got out, Grace would pay. He would make sure of it. He had nothing left to lose. He had been wronged in ways no man should ever have to experience. 15 years for a crime he didn't commit, all because of a lie crafted by Grace and Tony. Mason vowed to make them both pay, and prison gave him the time and space to meticulously plan every detail. While Mason was trapped behind those unforgiving walls, Grace's life seemed to continue on as if nothing had ever happened. She moved in with Tony, her lover, the man who had stood by her through the chaos she created. In the years after Mason's conviction, Grace did everything she could to erase the past. She changed her name, distancing herself from the life she once had with Mason, as though she could start fresh. And she did. With Tony by her side, Grace began to build a new life, a family, a home, a future. A perfect, pristine life, all crafted from the foundation of lies. Grace had the child she had always dreamed of. She and Tony played the part of the perfect parents, attending family gatherings, celebrating holidays, and sharing moments that would have seemed impossible in the years before. Christmas photos, birthday parties, the kind of moments Mason could never have imagined in his wildest dreams. To the outside world, Grace was a woman who had moved on, who had rebuilt herself after a tragic chapter in her life. But what the world didn't know was that her perfect life was built on something much darker. A lie. Grace had convinced herself that Mason was the villain, that he had betrayed her first, that he had abandoned their marriage, that he was guilty of the crimes he had been accused of. But deep down, a part of her knew the truth. She had chosen Tony over Mason. She had chosen the lie. She had chosen the easy way out. And with each passing year, As she lived her perfect life, that truth gnawed at her. It was buried, but it never completely disappeared. To the world, Grace was living the dream. To Mason, though, she was nothing more than a distant memory, a painful reminder of the woman who had stolen his future, taken his life, and left him to rot in prison. Every Christmas photo, every family gathering, every smile she flashed in public was a slap in the face to him. They were enjoying what was once his, and it made him sick. After 15 long years, Mason was released. But prison doesn't just let go of you. It marks you. When he stepped through the gates and into the world he thought he'd lost forever, the air was different, the light was different, but Mason felt no freedom. He had spent over half his life behind bars, and though his body had been freed, his mind was still trapped in the same darkness that had held him for all those years. And at the center of that darkness, the thing that had kept him alive, was the memory of Grace, the woman who had stolen his future, the woman who had lied and sent him away. Not a single day had passed without him thinking about her, about Tony, about the betrayal that had shattered everything. His release didn't bring the satisfaction he expected. There was no reunion, no warm embrace of family and friends. The world had moved on, and Mason was now a man out of time. But he had one purpose, one mission. It was not just about freedom. It was about justice. And justice, for Mason, meant answers. It meant finding Grace. It meant confronting the lies she'd built her life on. So Mason sought the help of a man who could uncover those answers. He reached out to a private investigator, a man who was as driven as he was someone willing to dig into the past. The investigator listened carefully as Mason outlined his story. The betrayal, the false charge, the years spent locked away. And then, Mason spoke the words that had fueled his every thought since he was arrested. I need to find Grace. The investigator didn't waste time. He got to work immediately, pulling every string, digging through records, and scouring the shadows of the life Mason had once known. Days passed, then weeks. The silence was unbearable. But finally, the investigator came through with information that Mason could barely believe, yet it confirmed what Mason had feared. The truth was far worse than he had imagined. Grace, it seemed, had never truly believed in Mason's innocence. Her mind had been poisoned by jealousy, by suspicion. She was convinced Mason was cheating on her, even though there was no proof. And that belief, that fear, was what led her to destroy him. The affair with Tony had begun innocently enough, but it quickly spiraled into something much darker, something far more dangerous than either of them had expected. The investigator showed Mason old photos, notes, and private conversations that Grace had kept hidden. There were texts where she told Tony her suspicions, where she convinced herself that Mason was unfaithful. And in those texts, there was no mention of the betrayal she was committing right in front of Mason's eyes. She had carefully crafted the lie that sent him to prison, a lie built on nothing more than insecurity, suspicion, and the need to feel justified in her own actions. As Mason sat in that smoky office, looking at the papers laid out before him, his heart pounded in his chest. Grace had not only ruined his life by betraying him, she had done so under the guise of righteousness. She had painted him as the villain, making him a monster when all he had ever been was a man who loved her. The truth was now laid bare before him, but instead of bringing him relief, it only fueled his anger further. The years of pain, of watching the world move on without him, of being forced to live in a cage, all of it had been because of Grace's jealousy, her mistrust. And Tony? Tony had been the catalyst, the man who'd slipped into Mason's life, pretending to be a friend while plotting to destroy him. Now, Mason had a choice to make. His body was free, but his soul was still in chains, locked in a prison built by Grace's lies. The investigator handed him a folder inside, photographs of Grace and Tony together, evidence of their life as a family. They had moved on, living the perfect life while Mason rotted away in prison. The weight of that folder felt unbearable in his hands. But the question wasn't just about what they had done. It was about what he was going to do next. Mason's journey led him south, to Savannah, a place that once symbolized the warmth of Southern comfort, but now felt like a cold, distant prison. He had tracked them down. Grace and Tony had built their life there, far from the life they destroyed in Charlotte. But nothing was going to protect them now. Not the city, not their home, not the years that had passed. The world had changed, but Mason's resolve had only hardened. It was time to confront the people who had stolen everything from him, who had trapped him in a nightmare he never deserved. He stood at the edge of their suburban street, staring at the house that would become the place where everything ended. The house was quiet, peaceful, too peaceful, the kind of house you'd expect from a family that had everything. A place that seemed untouched by time, where everything was in its place, where love and laughter should have filled the air. But in Mason's mind, it was nothing but a tomb, one that held the ghosts of his past. Mason approached the door, his heart heavy, his breath shallow. He knocked. The sound echoed through the emptiness. His hands shook, but his mind was clear. This moment, years in the making, was about to unfold. Grace opened the door. She was older, different. Time had softened her edges, but the woman behind those eyes was still the same, still the one who had sent him away, still the one who had built a life off the ruins of his. Her face went pale when she saw him. For a brief moment, a flicker of recognition crossed her face, a ghost of regret. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice trembling. Mason didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stepped inside. The door slammed behind him, sealing their fate. The house felt like a trap, too many memories and too much history wrapped in the walls that Grace had called home, that Tony had claimed as his own. The sound of his shoes echoed as he walked further into the house, and Grace stepped back, unsure whether to speak or flee. "It's been a long time, hasn't it?" Mason said finally, his voice calm, controlled, but underneath there was a storm. He could feel it building, rising inside him like a wave ready to crash. Tony appeared in the doorway, his usual cocky smirk replaced with a look of confusion. He glanced at Grace, then back at Mason. The tension in the room could have suffocated anyone else, but Mason stood there, unmoved. Tony took a step forward. "What is this, Mason?" he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "You come here after all this time, and you think you can just walk in and you don't get to talk?" Mason interrupted, his voice low but lethal. "You and Grace, you both ruined my life." His words landed with a weight, a truth that neither of them could escape. Grace's expression faltered as Mason's words hit her like a physical blow. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. She finally took a step toward him, almost desperate. "Mason, I never meant for any of this to happen. I didn't know. I didn't know what I was doing. I was confused. I stopped." Mason cut her off, his anger now boiling over. "You knew exactly what you were doing. You lied. You framed me for something I didn't do. I lost 15 years of my life because of you." His voice was rising now, his eyes locked on Grace with a mixture of pain and our age. Tony stood there, silent, watching the exchange. His face remained cold, detached, almost as if he couldn't feel the weight of what was happening. He had never been the one to feel anything, not even for Mason. "You knew the whole time, didn't you?" Mason asked, his gaze turning to Tony. "You knew she was lying. You helped her ruin me, and now you both live like nothing happened. What are you going to say now?" Tony didn't answer. He didn't have to. The look in his eyes was all Mason needed to see. He had no remorse. He never would. The silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. Grace stepped closer, her voice shaking. "Mason, please don't do this. Please. I was wrong. I see that now. Please. You don't have to do this." But it was too late. The years of pain, the suffering, the lies, they all led to this one moment. Mason had walked into this house seeking answers, seeking closure, but what he found was nothing but more lies, more deceit. The truth had never mattered to them. They had ruined his life, and now he was going to take back the only thing they had left him with his justice. In a flash, Mason's anger took over. The gun he'd been carrying for so long was already in his hand. He didn't hesitate. The room seemed to freeze. Mason aimed, and in the next second, the world erupted with a deafening sound. A single shot. Tony fell first, collapsing like a rag doll onto the floor, lifeless. Grace screamed, but her words were drowned out by the sound of another shot. Mason stood there, breathing heavily, looking at what he had done. The reality of it hit him all at once, but there was no going back that he walked out of the house, his footsteps heavy, like a man walking to the gallows. His hands trembled, blood still fresh on them. As he stepped into the cool night air, he didn't feel relief. He didn't feel justice. What he felt was emptiness, like a man who had finally crossed the line, who had exacted his revenge, but in doing so, had sealed his own fate. There was no turning back now. The only thing left to do was face the consequences of his choices. The night after the confrontation, Mason stood in front of the police station. The weight of what he had just done pressed down on him, but there was no fear in his heart, no hesitation. His decision had been made. The streets of Savannah were eerily quiet, as if the city itself was holding its breath. Mason knew there was no running, no escape from the consequences of his actions. He had walked through years of hell for revenge, but now he faced a different kind of hell. This wasn't about justice anymore. It wasn't about right or wrong. This was the price he would pay, and he knew it. He stepped into the station, the cool air filling his lungs as he walked past officers who barely looked up. His eyes were vacant, his movements mechanical. A man already resigned to his fate. The officer at the counter raised an eyebrow, but said nothing as Mason quietly placed his hands on the desk. "Turn me in," he said, his voice steady, almost calm. "I'm guilty." There were no words after that. The officer nodded, stood, and moved to take his fingerprints, as if this was just another routine. And in a way, for Mason it was. After everything that had happened, after everything he'd endured, it felt almost mundane. The final act of his tragic story had been written. The pages were turning. And this was the end. Mason sat in the back of the police car, his face pressed against the cold window. The city blurred past him, lights flashing like memories he couldn't escape. He wasn't looking at anything in particular. He was lost in thought, trapped in a place between what was and what could have been. The quiet hum of the car's engine was the only sound, and for a moment, he felt removed from everything. It was as though time had stopped, as though the consequences of his actions were just a faraway concept that didn't concern him anymore. He had crossed a line, yes, but wasn't it justified? After all, how many people would have endured 15 years for something they didn't do? How many could bear watching the world move on while they were locked in a cage of lies? He thought of Grace, of Tony, of their perfect life. They'd destroyed him, but they'd also destroyed themselves in their own way. He wasn't the only one who'd lost. Grace had lost herself. Tony had lost his humanity. And he had lost everything. But was it enough? Was it justice? The question clung to him like a shadow. Was his action the ultimate response to a system that had failed him? Or had he simply snapped, unable to deal with the weight of years of betrayal and rage? Could anyone truly blame him for taking control, for ending the nightmare once and for all? Or was he just another man broken by the world, trying to fix his pain through violence? In the sterile silence of the car, Mason couldn't find an answer. Only more questions, more doubts. Mason was escorted into the prison, his hands cuffed in front of him. The cold steel doors slammed shut behind him, locking him into a world he knew all too well. The guards didn't speak to him. They didn't need to. They'd seen men like him before, the ones who came back, who thought they could escape the past, only to find themselves trapped in it once again. The clang of the cell door as it closed was a sound he recognized all too well. The cold, familiar chill of concrete walls, the distant hum of other inmates, the echo of footsteps in the long, winding halls. It was all the same. Mason stood there for a moment, staring at the walls as if waiting for something. Waiting for the weight of the decision to hit him, or maybe for the release that he had once sought so desperately. But it didn't come. Instead, there was only the heavy silence of a man who had no future, only the past, and the consequences of his own choices. His cell felt smaller than it ever had before. It felt more like a coffin now, a reminder that some decisions are final. No parole, no redemption, just time. Was this what it had all been for? Was revenge truly worth the price of his own soul? The lights flickered overhead, and Mason took a slow, measured breath. His story was over. The question now was whether the story of his life could ever have ended any other way. This is the story of betrayal. But more than that, it's a story of broken trust and the irreversible damage it can cause. We often tell ourselves that love is a safe harbor, a place of refuge. But what happens when that harbor turns into a storm? When everything you thought you knew about someone shatters, and you're left in the wreckage. Mason Lucas loved Grace with all his heart. He trusted her, but that trust, like so many others, was betrayed. Not by a stranger, but by the person closest to him. And when betrayal is that deep, when it's someone who was supposed to be your partner, your protector, the one who stood by your side, it changes you. For years, Mason fought for his innocence, but when the truth became clear, it was too late. In those prison walls, something in him broke. What was left? A man who had been discarded by the system, discarded by the woman he loved, left to question whether there was anything worth fighting for anymore. But revenge became his only salvation, his obsession, his only way to take back what was stolen from him. Now, the question remains, was Mason justified in his actions? Was he a victim of a system that had failed him, of a world that pushed him too far? Or did the years behind bars twist him into something he could no longer recognize? Something monstrous? The truth is, there's no easy answer. Some will say that Mason's act of violence was a reckoning, a necessary evil in a world where justice so often fails the innocent. Others might say he lost himself long before the gunshot rang out that prison had done more than break his body. It had shattered his humanity. Mason might never have found peace, even if he had never taken another life. But the question we all must ask ourselves is this. When we are pushed to the brink, when we feel like the world has stolen everything we care about, how much of that humanity are we willing to give up in exchange for vengeance? What do you believe is the line between justice and revenge? Where do we draw the boundary? And when does the pursuit of one turn into the corruption of the other? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring the bell for more real stories of crime, betrayal, and the complicated web of morality.